It is the year 878. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms are in ruins, their lands shattered by a relentless Viking invasion. The great Christian monasteries of Lindisfarne and Iona have been pillaged, Northumbria has fallen, and Mercia has been subdued. One by one, the kingdoms have fallen under the weight of the Great Heathen Army, a vast force of Viking warriors led by the most feared chieftains of the time. Men like Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan Ragnarsson, and Ubba, all sons of the semi-legendary Ragnar Lothbrok. They came not just to plunder, but to conquer. The Viking conquest was more than just raiding. It was a war for control of the land. Now only one kingdom remains, Wessex, ruled by a young king named Alfred the Great. His forces are battered and his kingdom is on the brink of collapse. The once mighty line of Anglo-Saxon kings, the line of Cerdic, now rests on the shoulders of one man, Alfred. But this is not just a fight for a kingdom. This is a fight for survival. If Wessex falls, there will be no England, no future for the Anglo-Saxon people. The Viking onslaught will consume the last vestiges of resistance, and the land that we now call England will be ruled by the invaders. But Alfred was no ordinary king. In the most desperate hour, with his forces scattered and the enemy at the gates, Alfred would rise from the swamps of Somerset to lead one of the most remarkable comebacks in history. Through clever strategy, innovation, and sheer will, Alfred would not only defeat the Vikings, but he would lay the foundations for what would eventually become the Kingdom of England. The Viking Age was a time of immense upheaval across Europe, a period defined by fearsome raiders who sailed the seas, plundering the rich coastlines and striking terror into the hearts of Christian kingdoms. But by the mid-9th century, the Vikings were no longer content with simply raiding. They were here to conquer. The Viking Age didn't begin with the infamous raid on Lindisfarne, but rather in 789 AD, when the first recorded Viking attack took place on the Isle of Portland, off the coast of Wessex. A group of Viking warriors landed unexpectedly, and when a royal official attempted to collect taxes, he was killed, a brutal foreshadowing of the violence that would define the coming decades. This marked the first violent encounter between the Anglo-Saxons and the Viking invaders, though it passed with relatively little notice. But it wasn't until the raid on Lindisfarne in 793 AD that the full scale of the Viking threat became apparent. Lindisfarne, a peaceful Christian monastery on the northeastern coast of Northumbria, was brutally sacked by the Vikings. This sacred place, home to monks and religious treasures, was reduced to ruin. Monks were slaughtered, and religious relics were stolen or destroyed. The Christian world was shaken to its core. The raid on Lindisfarne signalled that the Vikings were no longer merely isolated marauders, but a force capable of striking at the heart of Christian society. Why did the Vikings target these sites, and how did this shift from raiding to conquest take hold? The wealth stored in monasteries, gold, silver, and treasures, made them prime targets for Viking raiders, but the significance of these attacks went beyond plunder. The raids on Portland and Lindisfarne were the opening chapters of a much larger story, a story that would evolve from mere raiding to full-scale conquest of Anglo-Saxon lands. In 865, a monumental shift occurred when a vast Viking force known as the Great Heathen Army landed in England. This was no mere raiding party. Led by the sons of the legendary warrior Ragnar Lothbrok, the Great Heathen Army came with a singular purpose: to conquer Anglo-Saxon England. According to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, this force swept across the land, and no kingdom seemed strong enough to stand in their way. The Great Heathen Army was led by some of the most feared Viking chieftains in history, Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan Ragnarsson, and Ubba. These men were the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok, a semi-legendary figure whose death at the hands of the Anglo-Saxons sparked their thirst for revenge. The saga of Ragnar's death, thrown into a pit of snakes by King Aella of Northumbria, fueled the fury of his sons, driving them to seek not just retribution, but domination. The Great Heathen Army began its conquest in Northumbria. By 867, York, the great city of the north, had fallen. The once proud kingdom of Northumbria was no more. Next, the Vikings turned south to East Anglia, where King Edmund met his fate. Legend has it that Edmund was tied to a tree and riddled with arrows before being beheaded by the Viking conquerors. He would later become known as Saint Edmund, a martyr for the Christian cause. But despite his sainthood, East Anglia was lost. One by one, the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms fell to the Viking onslaught. But what made Wessex so different? Why was Alfred's kingdom the only one to survive? By 870, only Wessex remained. The kingdoms of Northumbria, Mercia, and East Anglia had been subdued, their kings either dead or paying tribute to the Viking warlords. The once great Anglo-Saxon heptarchy had been reduced to a single kingdom. But Wessex was different. Its king Ethelred and his younger brother Alfred were determined to resist the Viking tide. In 871, Wessex stood on the brink of destruction. That year would come to be known as the Year of Battles, as Alfred and Ethelred led their forces into a series of bloody confrontations with the Vikings. In total, 9 battles were fought that year. Wessex survived, just barely. But who was Alfred, this young prince, who would soon take on the mantle of leadership in Wessex? What had shaped him into the man who would later be known as Alfred the Great? Alfred was born in 849, the youngest son of Ethelwulf, King of Wessex. His early years were not marked by military prowess or royal authority, but by something quite different: faith and learning. Alfred, unlike his warrior brothers, had a deep fascination with scholarship. As a child, he was sent to Rome, where he met the Pope and was exposed to the broader Christian world. He was anointed by the Pope as a young boy, which gave him a sense of divine purpose that would later shape his rule. At that time, he also travelled through Frankish Gaul and found out about different cultural and political systems. This broad knowledge later distinguished him from other English kings and helped him to overcome all obstacles he faced. How did this young boy, more drawn to the world of books and faith, become the warrior king that would save Wessex from the brink of destruction? Though Alfred's early interests were in scholarship, his destiny would be shaped by warfare. As the youngest of several sons, he was never expected to rule. His older brothers, including Ethelred, were the ones leading Wessex into battle. But as the Viking threat grew, fate would thrust Alfred into a role he had never anticipated. In 871, Wessex suffered a tragic blow. King Ethelred died after a series of brutal battles with the Vikings. Suddenly, the weight of the kingdom rested on the shoulders of young Alfred. He was now King of Wessex, and his first task was to defend his realm from the relentless Viking invasion. What was Alfred's first act as king, and how would he face the overwhelming Viking force that had already laid waste to most of Anglo-Saxon England? Alfred's early reign was marked by immediate crisis. The Great Heathen Army, led by Guthrum, a Viking warlord, was ravaging Wessex. The pressure on Alfred was immense. At just 22 years old, he was tasked with defending the last remaining Anglo-Saxon kingdom. In a series of bloody battles, Alfred struggled to hold the Vikings at bay. One of the most significant confrontations occurred at the Battle of Ashdown in 871, where Alfred, fighting alongside his brother Ethelred, led a fierce charge against the Viking forces. Though the battle was a tactical victory for Wessex, it was far from a decisive blow to the Vikings. The Viking army, as relentless as ever, continued its campaigns, and Alfred's forces were battered, his kingdom slowly being worn down by the seemingly endless onslaught. Alfred's challenges were not just military. Internally, Wessex was suffering from years of conflict. Crops had been destroyed by Viking raids, villages burned, and the people of Wessex were exhausted, fearful that their kingdom would soon fall like the others before it. Alfred, though a young and relatively inexperienced king, understood that his fight was not just for victory on the battlefield, it was for the survival of his people. But how could Alfred, leading a battered and demoralized force, possibly stand against the full might of the Vikings? What plan did he have to save Wessex from destruction? This would be Alfred's true test. Unlike his predecessors, who focused solely on battle, Alfred began to think in terms of long-term strategy. He knew that to defeat the Vikings, he needed to not just win battles, but also change the very way Wessex defended itself. Wessex's survival would depend not just on strength, but on cleverness, innovation, and resilience. As Alfred's forces regrouped, the king started to implement a series of revolutionary changes. He envisioned a new kind of warfare, one that would be less reliant on immediate, head-on battles and more focused on defensive strategy. Alfred began to understand that the Vikings thrived on their ability to move quickly, to strike unexpectedly, and to devastate lands that had little defense. Wessex needed to become a kingdom that could withstand these raids, a kingdom that could resist, recover, and ultimately repel the invaders. It's the year 878, and the Viking conquest of England is nearly complete. The once great Anglo-Saxon kingdoms have fallen like dominoes, one after another. Northumbria, East Anglia, Mercia, all subdued by the relentless Great Heathen Army. And now, the final and most daunting challenge lies before the Vikings, the Kingdom of Wessex, under the young king Alfred the Great. But this is not Alfred at the height of his power. This is Alfred in crisis, a king who has just suffered one of the most catastrophic defeats of his reign. In January of 878, the Viking forces under the command of Guthrum, one of their most fearsome leaders, launched a surprise attack on Alfred's court at Chippenham, a royal stronghold in the heart of Wessex. It was a bitterly cold winter, and Alfred's army had been caught completely off guard. How could such a young, promising king, now the last hope of Anglo-Saxon England, allow his forces to be overrun so suddenly? The Vikings had become masters of deception and swift assaults. While Alfred's forces were resting after a long winter of battles, Guthrum's army moved quietly and decisively under the cover of night. The attack was devastating. Alfred's forces, unprepared and outmaneuvered, were utterly defeated. The Battle of Chippenham would go down as one of the greatest calamities for Wessex. For Alfred, this defeat was more than just a lost battle. It was the near total destruction of his kingdom. The Viking forces were now entrenched deep in Wessex, and Alfred's army had been decimated. The once defiant king was forced to flee for his life, his kingdom in ruins, and his people scattered. With his forces shattered and Guthrum's Vikings hunting him, Alfred retreated to the swamps of Athelney in Somerset. These desolate, marshy lands provided the perfect hiding place for a king who had lost nearly everything. Here, Alfred lived in exile, cut off from his people, with only a few loyal men by his side. His kingdom, his army, and even his crown seemed lost. Alfred's story, however, does not end here. While he may have retreated physically, in spirit, Alfred was far from defeated. In these marshes, Alfred began to rebuild. He had been brought to his lowest point, but it was from this moment of desperation that Alfred's legend would truly begin. It was during these months in the swamps of Athelney that one of the most famous legends of Alfred the Great was born, the story of the burning of the cakes. As the legend goes, Alfred, now in hiding and disguised as a simple wanderer, sought shelter in the hut of a local peasant woman. Not knowing that the man before her was the king, she tasked him with watching her cakes as they baked over the fire. Lost in thought, contemplating the fate of his kingdom and how he could possibly rally his people once more, Alfred allowed the cakes to burn. The woman, oblivious to his royal status, scolded him harshly for his carelessness. Despite the gravity of his situation, Alfred reportedly took the scolding in good humor. While this may seem like a small, even humorous moment in Alfred's life, it symbolizes something far greater: Alfred's humility and his resilience in the face of overwhelming adversity. Even as a king, reduced to hiding in the marshes and being chastised for something as mundane as burning cakes, Alfred never lost sight of his ultimate goal: to save Wessex. But Alfred's time in the swamps was not wasted, far from it. In this moment of despair, Alfred began to devise a strategy that would not only reclaim Wessex, but would also turn the tide of history. He sent out secret messages to his loyal followers across the kingdom, rallying those who remained faithful to him. Slowly, from the shadows of the marshlands, a new force began to gather. But how could Alfred, with just a handful of loyal followers and a kingdom in ruins, possibly defeat the seemingly unstoppable Viking army that had already conquered so much of England? Alfred's genius lay in his understanding of strategy and guerrilla warfare. He knew that he could not face the Viking army head-on, not yet. Instead, he used the swamps and forests to his advantage, launching small, precise raids against Viking outposts, weakening their control over Wessex. Over the months, as winter turns to spring, Alfred's forces grew. The Anglo-Saxon people, hearing whispers of their king's survival, began to rally to his side. Hope, once lost, began to flicker in the hearts of his people. By Easter of 878, Alfred had gathered enough strength to face the Vikings once more. At Egbert's Stone, a historic meeting place in the heart of Wessex, Alfred's loyalists gathered, ready to follow their king into battle. This was more than just an army. It was a resistance, an entire people standing up against the invaders who had sought to destroy their way of life. This would be the moment of truth for Alfred and his kingdom. From the swamps of Athelney, a king reborn, Alfred would soon lead his forces into the Battle of Edington, a decisive clash that would change the course of English history forever. Alfred had been brought to his lowest point, his kingdom destroyed, his forces scattered, and his very survival in question. But from the swamps of Somerset, a king had risen. Through resilience, ingenuity, and sheer will, Alfred the Great would soon turn the tide of history. The fate of Wessex, and indeed the fate of what would become England, now rested on the outcome of one final battle. Alfred the Great's victory over the Vikings was not merely the result of brute force or sheer numbers. It was the result of one man's strategic genius and his ability to adapt in the face of overwhelming odds. After years of being on the defensive, Alfred realized that the very survival of his kingdom would require fundamental changes, a transformation of Wessex's military and defensive systems. Alfred understood that while a single battle could be won or lost, the future of Wessex depended on a long-term strategy. But how did Alfred, a king who had just fled to the swamps, transform his kingdom into a fortress capable of resisting the Viking onslaught? Alfred's solution was nothing short of revolutionary. He envisioned a network of fortified towns, called burhs, pronounced boroughs, spread strategically across Wessex. These burhs were not just military outposts, but self-sustaining communities designed to withstand a siege and provide refuge for the local population. Alfred's burh system was a stroke of military brilliance. He understood that the only way to protect Wessex from Viking raids was to create a network of fortified towns that could resist attack long enough for Alfred's army to respond. By spreading these strongholds across the kingdom, Alfred ensured that no part of Wessex would be left vulnerable. Each burh was heavily fortified with earthworks, wooden palisades, and stone walls. Inside these fortifications, people could flee from the countryside during times of Viking raids, bringing with them food, livestock, and supplies to wait out the attack. This system created a buffer between the Viking invaders and the heart of Alfred's kingdom, allowing his forces time to mobilize. Could these newly constructed burhs truly hold back the Viking onslaught, or were they simply delaying the inevitable? The burhs proved to be immensely effective. When the Vikings attempted to raid Wessex in the years following their defeat at Edington, they found that the once easy targets, villages and towns, were now heavily fortified and capable of withstanding prolonged attacks. These fortified towns became a defensive network, preventing the Vikings from moving freely across Wessex, as they had in the past. The burhs not only protected the people, but also cut off Viking supply lines, limiting their ability to wage sustained campaigns in the region. But fortifications alone would not be enough. Alfred knew that his military forces needed to evolve. The traditional Anglo-Saxon army, known as the fyrd, was a militia-based system in which farmers would take up arms when their lords called them to fight. This system had worked in earlier centuries, but the Viking threat required something more, a professional standing army that could respond quickly to raids and invasions. But how could Alfred, whose kingdom had been weakened by years of conflict, create a professional army capable of standing against the battle-hardened Vikings? Alfred's innovation was to split the fyrd into two rotating groups. One group would remain on active duty, ready to respond to threats at a moment's notice, while the other group would remain at home to tend to the fields and ensure that the kingdom's agricultural base remained intact. This system allowed Alfred to maintain a permanent defensive force without crippling the economy of Wessex. The new professional army trained continuously, improving their skills in shield wall tactics, spear formations, and archery. Alfred also began to adopt some of the Viking tactics, learning from their strategies and incorporating them into his own military doctrine. Alfred knew that to truly protect Wessex, he couldn't just defend the land, he needed to defend the seas. The Vikings were masters of naval warfare, their long ships allowing them to move quickly along the coastlines, striking wherever they pleased. To counter this, Alfred did something no other Anglo-Saxon king had done before. He created a navy. But how could Alfred, with no prior naval experience, hope to compete against the Viking longships, which had terrorized the seas for decades? Alfred ordered the construction of large warships, designed specifically to counter the Viking longships. These ships were longer and sturdier, capable of carrying more men and withstanding the rough seas of the English Channel. While the Viking longships were fast and maneuverable, Alfred's ships were built for combat, with the goal of engaging the Vikings directly and preventing them from landing their raiding parties. Alfred's navy was not immediately successful in every engagement, but over time the Anglo-Saxon fleet became a formidable force. By patrolling the coasts and intercepting Viking ships before they could land, Alfred's navy provided a critical layer of defence for Wessex. The Vikings could no longer rely on their swift raids. They now had to contend with a well-defended coastline. But Alfred's reforms didn't end on the battlefield. He knew that for Wessex to truly survive and prosper, it needed more than just military strength. It needed a strong foundation of law, education, and governance. Alfred believed that a well-governed kingdom would be more resilient in the face of external threats, and so he set about reforming the very structure of Anglo-Saxon society. But could a king born and raised in a time of constant warfare really transform his kingdom into a centre of learning and law? Alfred was not just a warrior king, he was a scholar. He personally worked to translate Latin texts into Old English, believing that knowledge should be accessible to all. He reformed the legal system, creating a code of laws that blended Christian principles with traditional Anglo-Saxon customs. This legal code ensured that justice was consistent and that the people of Wessex could live under the rule of law rather than the rule of fear. He invited scholars from across Europe to his court, establishing Wessex as a centre of learning and scholarship. This investment in education helped to strengthen the cultural identity of the Anglo-Saxon people, making them more united in their resistance against the Viking invaders. Alfred's reforms transformed Wessex from a kingdom on the verge of collapse into a fortress of resilience. His innovations in military strategy, defence, and governance would lay the groundwork for a united England. No longer would Wessex be vulnerable to the whims of Viking raids. The people had places to flee, armies to defend them, and a king who cared not only for their survival, but for their future prosperity. But would all of these reforms be enough? With Wessex fortified and prepared for battle, Alfred now faced the ultimate test, the Battle of Edington, where the fate of the kingdom would be decided once and for all. In May of 878, after months of preparation, strategy, and hidden resistance, the moment of truth had finally arrived for Alfred the Great and the people of Wessex. Everything, his kingdom, his people, and his very legacy, would be decided in one climactic confrontation, the Battle of Edington. The Viking warlord Guthrum, who had already ravaged much of Wessex, now sought to end Alfred's resistance once and for all. His great heathen army, though battered by months of guerrilla warfare and Alfred's growing defence network, remained a formidable force. The Vikings, notorious for their skill in battle and their thirst for conquest, were ready to crush what little remained of Anglo-Saxon opposition. But this time Alfred was prepared. Alfred had not come to this moment by chance. His months in the swamps, his strategic reforms, and his meticulous planning had all been leading to this. While the Vikings prepared for what they thought would be an easy victory, Alfred had something else in mind, a battle for the very survival of his kingdom. Alfred's genius lay not just in his military reforms, but in his ability to inspire loyalty and resilience among his people. He had spent months rallying his army, recruiting loyal nobles, and building a network of fortified burhs that had slowed down the Viking advance. Now, with the support of his newly trained standing army and the defenders of Wessex, Alfred knew he had one advantage Guthrum didn't: home soil. Alfred carefully positioned his army at Edington, a location where he could use the terrain to his advantage. It was here that the future of Wessex, and indeed what would one day become England, would be decided. As the sun rose over the horizon, the two forces stood face to face, thousands of men on both sides, each prepared to fight to the death. For Guthrum and his Vikings, this was their chance to finally conquer Wessex and secure the last Anglo-Saxon kingdom under their control. For Alfred, this was his final stand, his last hope to save his people. With his forces in position, Alfred ordered his men into the shield wall, a formation designed to withstand the brutal frontal assaults of the Viking berserkers. As the Vikings charged across the field, their infamous war cries echoing through the air, Alfred's men held their ground, shields locked, spears braced. The clash of iron filled the battlefield as the Viking onslaught smashed into Alfred's shield wall. The shield wall was a tactic used by both Anglo-Saxon and Viking armies, and it required not just strength but discipline and endurance. The first few minutes of the battle were critical. If Alfred's men could hold their formation, they could survive the initial Viking onslaught. If they broke, the battle and the future of Wessex would be lost. Alfred's men, trained and hardened by months of preparation, held fast. The shield wall bent but did not break. Slowly but surely, they began to push back, using their spears to jab through the gaps in the Viking formation. The battle turned into a grueling, close-quarters fight with neither side giving an inch. For hours the battle raged on, neither side willing to give up. But Alfred, ever the strategist, had not simply relied on defence. As his shield wall held firm, he ordered his reserves, a group of fresh, well-rested soldiers, to launch a counterattack on the Viking flank. The Anglo-Saxon counterattack hit the Viking flank with devastating force. Guthrum's army, caught off guard by the sudden maneuver, began to falter. The disciplined ranks of Alfred's soldiers pushed forward, and the Viking forces, once so confident of their victory, began to break under the relentless pressure. The tide had turned. By the end of the day, Guthrum's army was in tatters, their forces broken, and their dream of conquering Wessex shattered. Alfred had done the impossible. He had not only survived the Viking onslaught, but had delivered a decisive blow to their ambitions. Rather than pursue a campaign of destruction, Alfred saw an opportunity to negotiate peace. He met with Guthrum and offered terms that would reshape the future of both Wessex and the Vikings. The result was the historic Treaty of Wedmore. Guthrum agreed to convert to Christianity, and Alfred stood as his godfather during his baptism. The Vikings retreated to East Anglia, and a fragile peace was established. The Treaty of Wedmore marked a turning point in Anglo-Saxon and Viking relations. Guthrum and his Vikings would settle in the east in what became known as the Danelaw, a region where Viking law and customs would prevail. Meanwhile, Wessex, under Alfred's rule, would remain free of Viking control. But would this peace last, or was it merely a temporary reprieve from the Viking threat? Though the Treaty of Wedmore established a fragile peace, Alfred knew that the Vikings could return at any time. This peace gave Alfred the breathing room he needed to continue strengthening Wessex, building up his defences and laying the foundation for what would eventually become a unified England. The Battle of Edington had been a resounding success for Alfred the Great. Against all odds, he had defeated the Great Heathen Army led by Guthrum, securing a victory that would go down in history. But victory on the battlefield was only the beginning. Alfred knew that if Wessex was to survive, he needed to ensure a lasting peace, not just for himself, but for his people, who had endured years of devastation at the hands of the Vikings. But how could Alfred, a king of a relatively small kingdom, ensure peace with the Vikings, a force that had terrorized the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms for years? Could a treaty with these fearsome invaders really last? Alfred understood that true victory didn't always come through continued fighting. Sometimes it came through diplomacy. In the aftermath of Edington, Alfred made the bold decision to negotiate with Guthrum, a decision that would shape the future of Anglo-Saxon England. After the defeat at Edington, Guthrum had few options left. His army was shattered, his ambitions for Wessex dashed, and his men demoralized. But Guthrum was not without power. He still controlled vast lands in East Anglia, and his Vikings still held sway over large parts of England. For Alfred, this meeting was not simply about enforcing his victory. It was about securing a long-term peace that would protect his people from future Viking raids. Both leaders had much to gain, but also much to lose. But could Alfred trust Guthrum? Could a Viking warlord, whose people had ravaged England for decades, really be trusted to honour a peace agreement? Alfred knew that peace with the Vikings would only be possible under strict conditions. He demanded that Guthrum agree to convert to Christianity as a sign of his commitment to peace. Conversion was more than a religious act. It was a powerful symbol of submission. By becoming Christian, Guthrum would be signalling his acceptance of Alfred's authority and the laws of Wessex. In one of the most extraordinary moments in Anglo-Saxon history, Guthrum, the fierce Viking warlord who had once sought to conquer all of England, agreed to be baptized into the Christian faith. His baptism was not only a religious ceremony, but a public declaration of peace. By embracing Christianity, Guthrum was acknowledging Alfred's authority, and in a symbolic gesture, Alfred stood as Guthrum's godfather. For Alfred, the conversion of Guthrum was a victory not just of arms, but of spirit. By bringing Guthrum into the Christian fold, Alfred had achieved what few Anglo-Saxon kings before him had done. He had not only defeated the Vikings on the battlefield, but had also drawn them into his world, his culture, and his religion. However, Alfred knew that a religious conversion alone wouldn't be enough to secure lasting peace. He needed a more concrete solution, a political arrangement that would clearly define the boundaries between Viking and Anglo-Saxon lands. In the summer of 878, the terms of peace were formalized in the Treaty of Wedmore. This treaty established a clear division between Viking-controlled territories and Anglo-Saxon lands. Guthrum and his forces would withdraw to East Anglia, where they would settle and rule under Viking law in what would become known as the Danelaw. Danelaw was a region of England where Viking law and customs would dominate. It stretched from Northumbria in the north to East Anglia in the southeast, encompassing the lands the Vikings had already conquered. Under the terms of the treaty, Guthrum and his people could rule these lands independently, free from Anglo-Saxon interference. For Alfred, the Treaty of Wedmore was a necessary compromise. By allowing the Vikings to settle in Danelaw, he secured the safety of Wessex and the remaining Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The treaty allowed both sides to regroup, the Vikings to settle and rule their newly acquired lands, and Alfred to strengthen his defences and consolidate his power. The Danelaw and Wessex would now exist side by side, two vastly different societies living on the same island. In the Viking territories, Norse law and customs held sway. Viking settlers who had once come to England as raiders now built towns, farmed the land, and engaged in trade. Their society was still warlike, but they had begun to establish a more settled way of life in East Anglia. Meanwhile, under Alfred's rule, Wessex began to recover. The fortifications, the military reforms, and the legal systems Alfred had put in place allowed his people to rebuild their lives. Anglo-Saxon society, though battered by years of war, remained resilient. For the moment, a fragile peace existed. The Treaty of Wedmore had given both sides the space they needed to recover. But Alfred knew that peace was always fragile. The Vikings were still a warrior society, and their desire for conquest had not disappeared. The establishment of the Danelaw was a pragmatic solution, but it was also a reminder that England was still divided. Though Danelaw marked the division of Viking and Anglo-Saxon lands, it also facilitated a period of cultural exchange between the two peoples. Viking settlers in England brought with them their customs, language, and legal traditions. Over time, Norse words entered the English language, and Viking craftsmanship and trading practices influenced Anglo-Saxon society. Trade between Viking and Anglo-Saxon territories flourished. Viking traders brought silver, furs, and weapons from Scandinavia, while Anglo-Saxon merchants traded grain, textiles, and livestock. These exchanges helped to foster a certain degree of cooperation, even as tensions simmered beneath the surface. Though the Treaty of Wedmore established a temporary peace, the divide between the Danelaw and Wessex was always tenuous. Alfred's reforms had created a stronger, more unified Wessex, but the Viking presence in England remained a constant threat. Though Alfred had secured peace with the Vikings, his vision for the future extended beyond the borders of Wessex. He dreamed of a united England, free from Viking control. The Treaty of Wedmore had given him the breathing room he needed to strengthen his kingdom, but it also laid the foundation for something greater, a kingdom that could one day unite all Anglo-Saxon territories and resist future Viking invasions. The Treaty of Wedmore brought a fragile peace to England, one that would last for several decades, but the Viking presence in England was far from over. The Danelaw, while a practical solution for the moment, was a constant reminder that the Vikings had not been fully driven from the land. Alfred the Great had secured Wessex and laid the groundwork for a united England, but the path ahead would still be fraught with challenges. The question of Viking control and the possibility of future raids loomed large on the horizon. While Alfred the Great is best remembered for his military victories and his defence of Wessex from the Viking invaders, his true greatness extended far beyond the battlefield. Alfred's reign was not just a time of war, it was a period of profound cultural revival. Despite the constant threat of Viking raids, Alfred was determined to rebuild not just his kingdom's defences, but also its intellectual and spiritual foundations. At the heart of Alfred's cultural achievements was his unwavering belief in the power of education, learning, and law to strengthen his kingdom. He understood that a strong kingdom was not built on swords and shields alone, but on the minds and souls of its people. Alfred's passion for learning was unusual for a king of his time, especially one raised in the midst of war. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Alfred had a deep respect for education. He believed that the Anglo-Saxon people, in order to prosper and defend their way of life, needed to be literate and well educated. Alfred saw learning and governance as two sides of the same coin. He believed that wise rulers and well-informed citizens were essential to the stability and strength of Wessex. To that end, Alfred embarked on an ambitious mission to revive learning in his kingdom, particularly the knowledge that had been lost during years of war and Viking raids. One of Alfred's most significant contributions was the translation of important Latin texts into Old English, the common language of his people. He believed that knowledge should not be limited to the clergy or the elite, but should be accessible to all free men. Among the most famous works he translated, or had translated under his guidance, was Pope Gregory the Great's Pastoral Care, a guide for righteous and moral leadership. At the centre of Alfred's spiritual and intellectual journey was his long-serving priest, Assa. A deeply devout man, Assa was more than just a religious figure. He was Alfred's spiritual guide, his confidant, and in many ways, his moral compass. Assa's influence on Alfred cannot be overstated. In times of uncertainty, it was Assa who provided Alfred with the spiritual wisdom needed to navigate the turbulent waters of kingship. But how did a simple priest come to hold such an important place in the life of one of England's greatest kings? Assa had served as Alfred's priest for many years, even before the Viking invasions had reached their height. He was a quiet yet profoundly influential figure in Alfred's court. Assa's guidance helped Alfred balance his duties as a warrior king with his role as a protector of the Christian faith. It was Assa who reinforced Alfred's belief that God's favour was essential for the survival of Wessex, and that the king's duty was not just to defend his people, but to lead them spiritually. Under Assa's influence, Alfred took an active role in promoting Christianity throughout Wessex. He worked to rebuild churches that had been destroyed during the Viking raids, to restore monastic communities, and to ensure that the clergy were well educated in both religious and secular matters. Alfred's commitment to learning wasn't limited to religious texts. He also saw the need to reform the legal system in Wessex. He understood that justice and law were the cornerstones of a stable society. Drawing on the teachings of both Christianity and Anglo-Saxon tradition, Alfred created a code of laws that would serve as the foundation for his kingdom's governance. But how did Alfred, a king raised in the midst of war, create a system of laws that would endure for generations? Alfred's legal reforms were deeply rooted in Christian principles, but they also respected the ancient customs of the Anglo-Saxon people. His laws combined divine morality with practical governance, ensuring that justice was fair and accessible to all. Alfred's Doom Book, or Book of Laws, was a compilation of old Anglo-Saxon laws, Mosaic law, and the teachings of Christ. It sought to establish a sense of unity in a kingdom that had been fractured by war and invasion. These laws covered everything from theft and murder to land disputes and marriage rights. Crucially, they also emphasized the importance of mercy and fairness, reflecting Alfred's belief that a ruler should be both just and compassionate. Alfred's vision for Wessex went beyond war and law. He dreamed of a well-educated society where future generations could build upon the foundations he had laid. To this end, Alfred established the palace school at his court, inviting scholars from across England and even from Europe to teach noble children and future leaders. Alfred understood that knowledge was power. He believed that the only way to ensure the long-term survival of Wessex, and indeed a united England, was to invest in the education of the next generation. He personally oversaw the curriculum of the palace school, ensuring that his own children, along with the children of nobles, were taught in both Latin and Old English. The palace school became a centre of learning, where students were taught scripture, philosophy and history. Alfred also worked to ensure that the clergy in his kingdom were well educated, capable of leading their congregations with wisdom and understanding. It was through these efforts that Alfred laid the intellectual foundation for a united English identity. Throughout Alfred's reign, Assa remained a constant presence. While many of Alfred's advisors came and went, Assa stayed by his side until the end. His quiet faith and deep wisdom helped to shape Alfred's vision for Wessex, not just as a kingdom of warriors, but as a kingdom of faith, law, and learning. Assa's influence extended far beyond Alfred's personal faith. Under his guidance, Alfred became a king who saw the moral duty of leadership as essential to governance. The bond between king and priest was more than just political, it was spiritual. Assa's guidance helped Alfred to see his kingship as a divine mission, one that sought not only to defend Wessex, but to uplift his people. When Alfred the Great passed away in 899, his kingdom was forever changed. He had not only saved Wessex from the Viking onslaught, but he had also laid the foundations for what would become the United Kingdom of England. Alfred's legacy goes beyond his military victories. He was a king whose vision extended far into the future, shaping the course of English history long after his death. Though he is remembered as a warrior king, Alfred's greatest achievements were his cultural, legal and administrative reforms. He turned Wessex into a stronghold of learning, law and resilience, preparing his kingdom to face the challenges of the future. More importantly, he inspired his descendants and the Anglo-Saxon people to continue the work of unifying England even after his reign ended. Alfred's passion for education and learning had a profound and lasting impact on his kingdom. His efforts to revive literacy and scholarship among his people laid the intellectual groundwork for the eventual unification of England. Through his translations of Latin texts into Old English, Alfred ensured that knowledge and wisdom were accessible to all, not just the clergy or the elite. His establishment of the palace school and his dedication to educating both noble children and future leaders ensured that the next generation would carry forward his vision of a learned and cultured society. Alfred's emphasis on literacy also helped to preserve the Old English language, reinforcing a shared cultural identity among the Anglo-Saxon people that would later play a crucial role in the unification of the country. But how did these cultural gains survive after Alfred's death? Could his successors maintain the momentum of intellectual revival in the face of continued Viking threats? Alfred's successors, inspired by his dedication to learning and culture, continued his work. His son, Edward the Elder, and his grandson Athelstan built upon Alfred's legacy by promoting education and religious scholarship throughout their reigns. The royal court of Wessex remained a centre of intellectual activity, and the clergy, many of whom had been educated under Alfred's system, continued to play a key role in preserving and advancing knowledge. Alfred's cultural reforms had created a resilient society, one that was capable of withstanding external threats while maintaining its cultural identity. This cultural unity would become the bedrock of the future Kingdom of England. While Alfred did not live to see the full unification of England, his vision was clear: a single united kingdom, free from the Viking threat, ruled under one law and one king. This dream would be realized by his descendants, particularly his grandson, Athelstan, who in 927 became the first king to rule over all of England. Alfred's military reforms, his legal system, and his emphasis on cultural unity laid the groundwork for this monumental achievement. His son, Edward the Elder, continued to strengthen Wessex and expand its influence by conquering parts of Mercia and East Anglia. Edward's military victories over Viking-held territories were a direct result of the fortification system Alfred had established, ensuring that Wessex remained strong even after his death. Athelstan, Alfred's grandson, took the unification process even further. Athelstan's military victories, particularly his decisive win at the Battle of Brunanburh in 937, cemented his position as the ruler of all England. Alfred's vision had finally been realized. England was now a united kingdom, no longer divided into separate Anglo-Saxon realms. One of Alfred's most enduring legacies was his reform of the legal system. His Doom Book became the basis for much of Anglo-Saxon law and, eventually, English common law. His code of laws combined Christian values with the traditional customs of the Anglo-Saxon people, creating a legal framework that emphasized justice, mercy, and fairness. Alfred's legal reforms not only endured, they became the foundation for the English legal tradition that still exists today. His emphasis on fair trials, written laws, and the importance of education in governance helped to stabilize Anglo-Saxon society during a time of great upheaval. Over the centuries, Alfred's legal principles would evolve and become enshrined in English common law, influencing the legal systems of many countries around the world. Through his legal reforms, Alfred ensured that future kings of England would rule not just by the sword, but by law and justice. This principle of just governance became a cornerstone of English society and helped to create a stable and unified kingdom. Alfred the Great was both a warrior and a scholar, a rare combination in a time of relentless warfare and political chaos. He defended Wessex with courage and tenacity, but he also understood that true strength came from knowledge, justice, and spiritual faith. Alfred's dedication to learning, his belief in the power of education, and his respect for the rule of law set him apart from many other rulers of his time. His cultural achievements were as important as his military victories, and his influence on English identity would resonate for generations. Alfred is remembered as the Great, not just for his military accomplishments, but for his ability to transform his kingdom, both culturally and politically. He was a king who, in the face of overwhelming odds, rebuilt a shattered kingdom and laid the groundwork for the creation of England. His vision of a united England, his commitment to education, and his reforms in law and government earned him a lasting place in history. Alfred's legacy extends far beyond the boundaries of his lifetime. His reign was a turning point for England, a moment when the Anglo-Saxon people, under his leadership, began the long journey toward a united kingdom that would survive the Viking invasions and flourish for centuries to come. Alfred the Great's reign was not just a pivotal moment in Anglo-Saxon history, it was the beginning of what would become the Kingdom of England. His military victories saved Wessex, but it was his vision for a united England, his commitment to law, and his belief in the power of education that ensured his place among the greatest kings in English history. The legacy of Alfred the Great is felt even today in the laws, traditions, and institutions of modern England. He is not just remembered for saving a kingdom, he is remembered for building a nation. Alfred the Great was more than a king. He was a visionary who laid the foundations for the united England we know today. His legacy, built on courage, wisdom, and resilience, still echoes through the centuries, shaping the laws, culture, and identity of modern England. Through his military victories, legal reforms, and dedication to education, Alfred not only saved Wessex, but helped create a lasting future for his people. His story reminds us that even in the darkest times, leadership and vision can change the course of history. If you enjoyed learning about Alfred the Great, make sure to subscribe for more fascinating stories from history. Don't forget to like, share and comment to let others discover this incredible legacy. And be sure to check out our other videos for more insights into the medieval world and the rise of England. Thanks for watching.